May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Well, after reading today's gospel, the term gaslighting kept bugging me all week, last week. I couldn't get rid of it. I kept thinking, did they just try to gaslight Jesus? Did they realize that they're trying to trick God? And then I thought, do we really think we can gaslight God? So to be clear, because some people don't always know what that term means, but Wikipedia says, and there's a bunch of other definitions for this, but this is a short and succinct one. And it says, gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which a person or a group covertly sows seeds of doubt in a targeted individual or group, making them question their own memory, perception, or judgment, often invoking in them cognitive dissonance and other changes, including low self-esteem. Using denial, misdirection, contradiction, and misinformation, gaslighting involves attempts to destabilize the victim and delegitimize the victim's beliefs. Have you ever experienced it? Yeah. Sometimes it's overt and sometimes it's covert. I remember facilitating anti-racism trainings, especially when I was a new priest. It was harder then. But inevitably, there would be one or more individuals, and actually, to be more precise, usually they were priests, other priests. And you can imagine what they were like. But anyway, inevitably, there would be one or more individuals who were not receptive to the training. Imagine that. They would make statements like, you can't say that racism is systemic, or you've done well in the church, so you can't really say that racism is an issue in the church. Even as a bishop, it's an issue. It still happens. And in these situations, I have varying degrees of success dealing with these assaults. Sometimes I ignore it and make a note to myself. Sometimes I'm clear-headed and I'm able to speak calmly instead of showing my anger and hurt. I don't always yell. And instead, I point out statistics and information from other experts, especially white ones, to prove that I'm not crazy or making things up. But when it's more personal, it's much harder. And I'm always glad when I can call it out. But it's not easy and it's painful. It makes me angry and frustrated because I have to sit with the reality that not only may what I have said not change hearts or minds, too often, my framing of my experience and reality will still be dismissed. It can be written off as she doesn't want to listen or doesn't know better. So many times I've wished I could have had the clarity and cleverness of Jesus to turn the tables on someone or entities trying to garner my approval or of injustice or easy and silent participation in systems that deny the human dignity of others or myself. And when I thought about the Pharisees and Herodians coming together to entrap Jesus, I tried, but I couldn't stop thinking about gaslighting. How the Pharisees and Herodians used manipulation and dysfunction to keep people from being themselves, to keep people in their place. Well, I am certainly not clever like Jesus. And while we're not necessarily called to clever comebacks, I do believe that through this gospel, we are shown the necessity of learning to thoughtfully live with the dissonance that comes from living our lives as citizens of heaven and of this world. It doesn't always sit easy to live in both places. And there are no easy answers. Instead, I can guarantee you this, that placing our allegiance with God, with the God of love, will always cause us to be mindful of the compromises and contradictions we will face as we navigate life. I'll say that again. Placing your allegiance with Jesus will always cause us to be mindful of the compromises and contradictions we will face as we navigate life. As followers of Jesus, our challenge is to remember who and whose we are. We have found favor in God's sight, and God knows us by name. Regardless of what society will tell you about yourself, you have found favor in God's sight, and God knows you by name. The Herodians were supporters of the occupying government, while the Pharisees were not in support of the occupiers, but on a certain level, they did cooperate. And this unholy alliance, Herodians and Pharisees, they plotted and conspired together and tried to hide their malicious intent in words of flattery. Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with the truth and show deference to no one. For you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Never one for a straight answer, Jesus acknowledged their gaslighting, asked them to show the coin for taxes. All parties clarified whose image and what was engraved on the coin. And then Jesus said, give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's. So some claim this passage is about separation of church and state. But such a notion was not even part of the thinking. It wasn't part of the political and religious understanding of the players in this story. And to avoid going down a rabbit hole of explaining the economic, religious, and politics and the thinking of first century Jews living under Roman occupation in the time of Jesus and the writing of this gospel, I'll just say, in the 6th chapter of this gospel, Jesus said, no one can serve two masters. And then it might be easier to read this lesson about paying taxes as Jesus's endorsement to comply with governmental rules. But that is also not the point. The coin Jesus referred to was both blasphemous and a sign of oppression. Besides being required to pay taxes to an occupying government, the proceeds from this coin were used to fund the occupying army. So they paid for the soldiers that harassed them and kept them in place. And on one side of the coin, which the denarius, one side was the image of Tiberius, the emperor, and on the other, the inscription stating that the emperor was God. So the Pharisees' main complaint about this arrangement was the inscription that required them to agree with a statement that was contrary to their faith. Everyone in that conversation knew that all of this, that coin, was antithetical to the commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. In fact, Jesus really called them out by asking them for the coin because it should never have been in the temple in the first place. Because the sacred texts say that there shouldn't be any images of God or any idols of any sort. And yet someone had it on their person in the temple. And so they were asking Jesus if he was supportive of the emperor who claimed to be God, or was his devotion to his people and his God. Now, if Jesus said that his allegiance was with the emperor, he would be violating God's commandments handed to Moses. For this, Jesus could also be excluded from the temple. And if Jesus said that paying taxes to the emperor was wrong, he could be taken to jail for treason. Well, Jesus' answers to difficult questions are never, you can count on this pretty much. His answers are never an endorsement of the status quo or permission to stay where we are. Jesus' answers are always an invitation for self-examination, always an invitation to grow more and more into the stature of a grown, mature child of God. Sometimes people get a little turned around by hearing child of God. I'm my mother's child, but I'm a grown woman. And that's what God wants from all of us, is to be grown, mature, thinking adults, and to work our way towards that. Sometimes kids get it better than we do. Jesus' answers are always an invitation to truly live as the beloved of God. And our gospel this morning said, "Give therefore to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and to God the things that are God's." With this statement, Jesus made the Pharisees, Herod's people, and us ask ourselves many questions about our devotion to God. Ask us questions about our understanding of what it means to be a child of God, made in the divine image, and what it means to live with our dual citizenship as citizens of earth and of heaven. It is so hard to determine what obedience we owe to civil authorities. In his writings, Paul urged followers of Jesus to cooperate. But to what extent? Civil authorities have been known to devise laws that run counter to allegiance to the God of love. Jesus was executed by civil authorities because he wouldn't pledge his allegiance to anything but God. Jesus wouldn't pledge his allegiance to anything but love. This was the very essence of the disagreement between Jesus and the Herodians, the religious leaders he contended with. Our country was built on or grown in the soil of discontent over the payment of taxes to a foreign monarchy. And at one point, the official motto of the United States was "E pluribus unum." You all have heard that one, right? From many, one. But then in 1956, it was changed to "In God we trust." The new official motto had already found a home on some of our currency as early as 1864. Our money states a claim also, "In God we trust," which bears an indictment because of its audacity. If this nation trusted in God or trusts in God, why would we choose currency to make this statement and not also make this statement through our actions and our laws? I find it disturbing that the distribution of our national acclamation of faith, money bearing the confession of trust in God, is so grotesquely distributed, as if to say, the more you trust in God, the more money you will have. Gaslighting at its finest. For most of us, there is no question about whether we will pay taxes. However, other questions arise. Do we feel more compelled to meet commitments to the government before we consider our financial commitment to our church? And to what extent will our obedience to the laws of this land conflict with our allegiance to Jesus, to God, or to one another? What belongs to God? And if all things come of God, what belongs to the emperor, or to us for that matter? And while I don't think that this passage, because it's so funny, it comes during stewardship time, and I think somebody missed the mark. But while I don't think that this is about stewardship, it does force us to see the inconsistencies in how we maintain our identity as God's beloved, and the difficulty of being truthful about our relationship to material things, creation, ourselves, and God's sovereignty over all things. Whether we say, "In God we trust," or "Jesus, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality," or if we say, "All things come of thee and of thine own have we given," we have to be careful. We have to be careful that when we say these things, we also wrestle with what it means to let our words and actions acknowledge these statements. As we say these things, we should also be asking, what does it look like to have found favor in God's sight? And for God to know us by name, what does that look like? When we say, "In God we trust," or "All things come of thee," when these words fall from our lips without thought, it can be as if we're trying to lie to God, others, and ourselves. And I don't think any of us is really trying to gaslight God. Not really. Living in today's society, it's hard not to play the my stuff and God stuff game. The game where we divide our life, our time, our energy, and resources into neat little compartments. The game where God's compartment takes up much less space than everything else in our lives. How often we allow our worries, concerns, and circumstances to affect how we make decisions in our lives. And often these decisions lead us to rely more on ourselves and our own insights than on God's love and provision for us. It doesn't feel right. The discomfort of the dissonance of the claim that we love God fully and the choices to cooperate and collude with institutions and powers of this world cannot be alleviated by the comforting narratives we concoct. And I guess we are able to choose perfectly. After all, Jesus did. However, it's more likely that we will struggle to know ourselves fully and live freely as people whose allegiance is only with God, who knows us and loves us beyond all comprehension. Some days, in our words and actions, it is evident that God is our all. And some days we live confidently in the knowledge that we have found favor in God's sight and are known by name. But some days, when we choose to align ourselves with the world, we know it. We feel shame because the choice is hard, because we're pressured, because we're weak, because society will punish us. But whatever the reason, when we choose the world and not love, it is so tempting to not own the choice and instead tell ourselves we've done our best, or lie to ourselves and think we fooled God into believing us. Acknowledging that all things belong to God causes us to do deep discernment about our allegiances. When we acknowledge that all things belong to God, we won't settle for easy answers and will examine the dissonance within ourselves. This process of lifelong examination increases our ability to make our identity as God's own more evident in our lives. At times, it seems like it is an impossible struggle, but that internal struggle is a sign of growth and transformation. Don't hide from it. The more we ascribe to God, we realize that not only do our blessings, life, and the whole created order belong to God, but even our worries, even our concerns belong to God. Even those places where we feel like, "God, I wish I could do better. All of that belongs to God. In these difficult times, and always, our gospel this morning is about knowing in whose image you are made, knowing whose image has been stamped on your heart. It is about living confidently with the knowledge that God has called you by name and that you have found favor in God's sight.